So in the last class we read how Stephen reacted to the Christian brothers, and then he creates a phrase and recites it, a day of dappled sea-born clouds. The phrase itself is not very significant. It is a nature imagery, but it is the sound of the words and the rhythm of the phrase which makes it aesthetically pleasing. So, reciting it loudly, Stephen wonders, why does he find it beautiful? The phrase and the day and the scene harmonized in a chord. Words. Was it their colors? He allowed them to glow and fade, hue after hue. Sunrise gold, the russet and green of apple orchards, azure of waves, the grey fringed fleece of clouds. No, it was not their colors. It was the poise and balance of the period itself. So what is particularly aesthetically pleasing in these words? And he imagines that words may have colors, several pleasing colors. In this we see a synesthetic imagination. The romantic poet and critic Coleridge had theorized about synesthesia, which means perception, simultaneous perception of several senses. So it is an experience in which visual, olfactory, tactile, different senses seem to blend together and give a composite experience. So when Stephen thinks of words, he thinks of their colors. We know words do not have colors, but in the imagination, words may take upon themselves colors. The French symbolist poet Arthur Rimbaud has a poem in which he talks about colors of different words of the alphabet, or of the vowels more precisely. So this kind of imagination is not unknown, and he decides that it is not the colors of the words, but it is their poise or balance and rhythm. So balance and rhythm of the period which attracts him more. How do we perceive balance and rhythm of a period? We perceive it through hearing. So auditory perception. Did he then love the rhythmic rise and fall of words better than their associations of legend and color? So is it the association of words with particular myths, particular stories, or any color associated with them that attracts him more, or is it the rise and fall of their sounds? Or was it that being as weak of sight as he was shy of mind, he drew less pleasure from the reflection of the glowing sensible world through the prism of a language many-colored and richly storied than from the contemplation of an inner world of individual emotions mirrored perfectly in a lucid, supple, periodic prose? So whether his visual imagination is not that strong, and that is why he does not think of the colors, but it is the contemplation of the emotions which can be perceived through the sounds that attracts him more. So in this passage we see a reflection of Stephen's aesthetic sensibility. We have already seen that he is always attracted by words, sounds, images, colors, and so on. But now Joyce is portraying how Stephen's aesthetic sensibility is maturing, because at the end of the novel Stephen will construct an aesthetic theory. Then he was walking and he passes the bridge over which the Christian brothers had marched, and then he hears his friends calling him. So his friends, they bully him or they tease him, which is common among young boys. "Hello Stephanos, here comes the Daedalus." So the friends were picking upon the strange name of Stephen, and they are calling Stephen's name with a Greek declension. So Stephen is Stephanos in Greek, and Daedalus is of course a Greek name. Then they bully him further by trying to drown him in the waves. "Hey, give it over, Dwyer. I am telling you, or I will give you a stop in the kissa for yourself. Good man Towser, duck him. Come along, Daedalus. Bous Stephanoumenos, Bous Stephanophoros." So these two addresses, Bous Stephanoumenos and Bous Stephanophoros, they are repeated a number of times. And as his friends call him by this Greek phrase, Bous Stephanoumenos means the sacrificial bull. So in Greece, when people sacrificed bulls, they would garland it and crown it with garlands. So Bous Stephanoumenos means the sacrificial bull, the crowned bull, and Bous Stephanophoros, the garlanded bull. Their banter was not new to him, and now it flattered his mild, proud sovereignty. Now as never before, his strange name seemed to him a prophecy. Sovereignty, which means that he feels himself to be sovereign, to be absolutely free of any rule by anybody else. In other words, he feels himself to be completely independent and free. So the teasing by his friends cannot subdue him, because in his mental life he is free, and he reflects on his name, whereas his friends joke with this name and pronounce it in a Greek way to present how this name is very strange. Stephen feels that he must have some kind of identification with this name of Daedalus, and it must be a prophecy, some kind of prophecy, that Stephen got this name because this name is going to be very significant in his life. Now, Stephen Daedalus, you can see that here the two parts of Stephen's name. The first part, Stephen, is the name of the first Christian martyr or saint, Saint Stephen. He was killed by throwing rocks. In the Christian canon, Saint Stephen is the first saint to be martyred. So the first part of Stephen's name is Christian, and the second part, Daedalus, the Greek name of the Greek artist who created wings and who flew. So Daedalus is an artist and Stephen is a martyr, and therefore we may imagine that an artist often plays the role of a martyr because he martyrs himself to the cause of his art. He sacrifices a lot of things. He sacrifices homely happiness, and he is always in conflict with his society. He always feels alien and strange, and he always feels that he has to fulfill some mission. So he must do something significant in his life. He is always in search of something significant which he can do by his art. So Stephen feels this like a prophecy, So timeless seemed the grey warm air, so fluid and impersonal his own mood, that all ages were as one to him. A moment before the ghost of the ancient kingdom of the Danes had looked forth through the vesture of the haze-wrapped city. So the Danes had conquered the British Islands before the Germanic tribes came there, before the Anglo-Saxons came there. And Stephen imagined that he lives in eternity, and he can imagine the rule of the Danes, or the period when the Danes were there, the ancient kingdom. Now, at the name of the fabulous artificer, he seemed to hear the noise of dim waves and to see a winged form flying above the waves and slowly climbing the air. What did it mean? Was it a quaint device, opening a page of some medieval book of prophecies and symbols? A hawk-like man flying sunward above the sea, a prophecy of the end he had been born to serve, and had been following through the mists of childhood and boyhood. A symbol of the artist forging anew in his workshop out of the sluggish matter of the earth, a new soaring, impalpable, imperishable being. So in his imagination he sees a man flying high above the seas, soaring towards the sun, and this image of Daedalus, for Stephen, it has some meaning, and he is trying to understand the meaning, as if this symbol has come out of the medieval book of prophecies and symbols, and the symbol of a hawk-like man flying sunward above the sea. So we have this bird image, the image of the hawk. Why the hawk? Probably because the hawk can fly very high. So the hawk can soar higher and higher. And then he himself interprets this symbol as a symbol of the artist who forges a new, impalpable, imperishable being out of the sluggish matter of the earth. So what is the meaning of this? We may say that through art, the artist sublimates our everyday ordinary existence and gives it a heightened and elevated sense. We are reminded of Philip Sidney's phrase in The Defense of Poesy, that this world is brazen, only the artist delivers a golden world. So this world is crass, sluggish matter here, as Stephen says. It can be made noble, it can be sublimated only through art. His friends go on teasing him, and they are bathing in the sea. An ecstasy of flight made radiant his eyes and wild his breath, and tremulous and wild and radiant his wind-swept limbs. 1, 2, look out! Oh Christ, I am drowned! 1, 2, 3, and away! Stephanophoros. So they are all playing in the water, trying to drown one another, mockingly of course, not seriously, and they are bullying Stephen, and they call him Stephanophoros. His throat ached with a desire to cry aloud, the cry of a hawk or eagle on high, to cry piercingly of his deliverance to the winds. So this desire to cry, this cry is not out of sadness, but this cry is compared to the cry of a hawk, that is the sound, piercing sound made by a hawk, which can soar very high, which means that Stephen feels some sort of deliverance and a moment of ecstasy, which a joy he wants to express through a cry. And he feels that he has come across his past childhood and boyhood. So he has arrived at a moment of maturity. His soul had arisen from the grave of boyhood, spurning her grave clothes. So this is an image of resurrection. A soul arises spurning its grave clothes, at the resurrection. Yes, 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 he would create proudly out of the freedom and power of his soul as the great artificer whose name he bore, a living thing, new and soaring and beautiful, impalpable, imperishable. So the resurrected soul of Stephen is impalpable and imperishable. And he imagines that this resurrected soul is symbolized by Daedalus, the artificer, because Daedalus also tried to attain a higher plane of being by devising or discovering the technology of flying, and left the earth to soar above it. Then he is barefoot and he walks on the sand on the beach, and then he will soon come to encounter the bird girl, or simply a girl who looks like a bird. And in this bird girl image, the two basic motifs, or you may say images or symbols in this novel, the bird and girl, they merge. So there are many girl images in the novel, there are many bird images in the novel, but in the bird girl the two images merge. So what are the significances of these two images? The girl image stands for the pursuit of the anima and pursuit of some noble desire. We may also say the sexual desire sublimated through the noble pursuit of art. So the girl image leads Stephen through a spiritual progress, we may say. Even though initially it is the sexual drive, the libido, yet it also becomes his spiritual drive through sublimation. As we know that Dante in his Divine Comedy imagined that his lover Beatrice helps him to progress through a spiritual journey. So up to a point the older poet Virgil was Dante's guide, but when it becomes the question of passing through heaven, then Beatrice takes upon herself this role. So Virgil was Dante's guide when he was traveling through hell, through Inferno, and then Beatrice becomes his guide and takes her through heaven. And why is this significant? Because in this novel also Joyce very much has Dante in his mind, and that becomes clear when we see in Stephen's dream he sees the hell-like creatures, the evil creatures who can be seen in hell, hellish creatures. And then towards the end of the novel, Stephen also imagines that he sees or he thinks of the beatific vision of the white rose in Dante Paradiso. This white rose is described. Why does Joyce use these Dantean motifs? Because like Divine Comedy, in this novel also the protagonist has a spiritual journey. But since it is a modern novel, so the spiritual journey has less association with religion, but with the development of the psyche. In this novel, Joyce presents religion to be essentially limited. So there lies the difference between Dante and Joyce, because Dante, as a medieval poet, he believed in religion and Christian religion, and he believed in the real spiritual salvation of the soul. But here this notion of spiritual progress and salvation, that is only a metaphor for the progress of the psyche of the protagonist. That is psychical maturity, and Stephen reaches this maturity at the end of the novel. So the spiritual progress here means basically development of the mind or development of the psyche. So he is walking on the beach. Where was his boyhood now? He is looking back and reflecting on his boyhood. Why is it important? Because we look back at something only when we think that we have crossed a particular stage. So Stephen has crossed his boyhood and reached adolescence. So he looks back at his childhood and boyhood. Where was his boyhood now? Where was the soul that had hung back from her destiny to brood alone upon the shame of her wounds, and in her home of squalor and subterfuge to queen it in faded cerements and in wreaths that withered at the touch? Or where was he? Stephen always refers to his soul in the feminine. We may wonder why. Probably because Stephen imagines that, for example, when vis-a-vis his father or vis-a-vis any father figure, he felt intimidated. Then he felt that his soul was being castrated or being punished. So the doggerel, pull out his eyes, apologize, with which the novel began. So a psychoanalyst critic writes that pulling out of eyes or destroying vision is a metaphor for castration, which is a psychological anxiety. And therefore Stephen imagines his soul to be castrated, to be punished, or sometimes to be penetrated, and so on. As in the earlier chapter where Stephen was very religious, he felt his soul to be penetrated by this higher power. So in his childhood and boyhood, he had this sense of loneliness. He was alone, he was unheeded, happy and near to the wide heart of life. He was alone and young and willful and wild-hearted, alone amid a waste of wild air and brackish waters, and the sea harvest of shells and tangle, and veiled grey sunlight, and gay-clad, light-clad figures of children and girls, and voices, childish and girlish, in the air. Very strange sentence, or we may say the sentence carries his stream of consciousness very perfectly. The first sentence of the paragraph, he was alone, that sentence joins his past with his present. So in his boyhood and childhood he was alone, unheeded, and even now, right now, at the present moment, he is alone, and he feels that his heart is wild and elated, and reference to childish and girlish figures and voices. And these references help us to accept the image that immediately is introduced, the image of the girl. A girl stood before him in midstream, alone and still, gazing out to sea. She seemed like one whom magic had changed into the likeness of a strange and beautiful seabird. Her long, slender, bare legs were delicate as a crane's, and pure, save where an emerald trail of seaweed had fashioned itself as a sign upon the flesh. Her thighs, fuller, soft-hued as ivory, were bared almost to the hips, where the white fringes of her drawers were like featherings of soft white down. Her slate blue skirts were kilted boldly about her waist and dovetailed behind her. Her bosom was as a bird's, soft and slight and soft, as the breast of some dark plumaged dove. But her long fair hair was girlish, and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty her face. This description surpasses any ordinary description because it is a realistic description of the girl. At the same time, it indicates a number of things. It indicates many layers of interpretations, possible interpretations. So like Stephen, the girl was also alone. And the girl, by some magic, as if it acquired the similarity or resemblance with a bird. And then the image of the bird, why a bird? Because the long legs, exposed legs, and the drawers, the skirt is tucked up, so the drawers are visible, and the fringes of the drawers, they look like plumes of a bird, and then her breast softly rising and falling, that also resembles the breast of a dove. So the girl has many similarities with a bird figure, and as on the beach or on the sea we sometimes expect, or sometimes we can see birds standing in the water. So here this girl was standing, and the girl is described in a sensuous way, but also in a symbolic way. So there are simultaneous perceptions possible by the reader of the sensuality of the image and the interpretations of the sensuality and the symbolic significance of the image. So on the one hand, the sexual desire or libido is expressed through this image of the girl who exposes her legs, and Stephen notices her hips, her bosom. So all this male gaze stands for the pursuit of libido or the sexual drive, and also the sea moss, which is green in color, sticking to her legs, emerald in color, green in color, that reminds us of how earlier when Stephen was a little boy, he looked at the girl in a room, in a social gathering, and looked at her stockings. So this look at a particular part of the body, or we may say attraction of a particular part of the body, that is called a fetish, a sexual fetish. So this is undoubtedly a sexual gaze, but that is not all, because there are other symbolic layers, and the long slender legs are of the complexion, and the thighs have the complexion of ivory. And earlier also we have seen that Stephen in his childhood, when he looked at the arms of the Irish girl, the ivory arms, ivory colored arms, the same image of ivory was used, and then Stephen remembered that Virgin Mary was also praised in these same terms, house of ivory, tower of gold, and so on. So the ivory complexion of the thighs suggests both religion and aesthetic beauty, and we may say sexual desire, all combined together. And her long fair hair was girlish, and girlish was her face. So you see, girlish and girlish. This word girlish is repeated in a strange syntax, the last part of the sentence, instead of which has an inversion. Instead of saying that her face was also girlish, the sentence goes on like girlish was her face. So this inversion helps in bringing together the two girlish, the word girlish used twice in close proximity, creating a kind of emphasis, a suggestion that this girlhood is important, or this girlish feminine quality is important. She was alone and still, gazing out to sea, and when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. So here we have a perfect description of a male gaze. So according to modern psychoanalytical theory and gaze theory, the male gaze stands for lust. But in this case, lust is there, but that is not all, because after this experience, Stephen does not pursue the girl, but he feels that he must soar high, he must abandon everything and fly higher. And some critics, feminist critic has suggested that it is very strange that the seductive image of the girl, instead of it leading Stephen towards any kind of sexual fulfillment, it makes him desire abandoning everything and fly higher. So in Stephen's gaze there is lust and there is worship. You see the language that Joyce uses, the worship of his eyes. So why is this religious language? The image of the girl blends with, in the reader's unconscious also it blends with the image of Mary, because earlier Joyce used the word ivory with reference to Mary. So this religious connotation is hidden, or we may say embedded within the sensual description, and there is no shame or wantonness, which means that the girl is not ashamed. She feels perfectly natural in this natural setting. So this rejection or this denial of shame or wantonness suggests that this is not a moment of sexual fulfillment or only of sexual drive. This is a moment of transcending this sexual desire and pursuing a higher desire. And this moment is also interpreted as a moment of epiphany, that is a moment of sudden revelation. So you see something ordinary and you have a sudden revelation, a flash or an intuition that this ordinary image has a symbol, it is a symbol which has a higher significance or some superior significance. So here the bird girl image is a symbol of conflation of two drives, we may say, and transcending of one drive by another. So what are the two drives? It is the pursuit of lust or sexual desire, and it is the pursuit of anima or the pursuit of the soul for a higher fulfillment, which in Stephen's case will mean a fulfillment through aesthetic experience or creation of art. So after this experience, Stephen realizes that he must create, and the girl is an image of creativity. So we will look further into this girl image, and I refer to an essay by Norman Holland where he analyzes the crane image. The long legs of the girl is Stephen thinks like the long legs are like that of a crane. Now the significance of the crane is that multiple significance are there. The cranes, when they fly in a V pattern of the letter V, or in other words, they create a letter when they fly. So the crane is associated with literary secrets in Irish myth. So you may note down these things. Number one, a crane is associated with literary secrets in Irish myth. Number two, the crane is sacred to Delian Apollo, god of learning. Apollo was a god of learning, and the crane is a sacred bird to Apollo. Third, the crane is sacred to Thoth, who invented writing according to ancient myth. The god Thoth, I think according to Norwegian myth, Thoth was a Norse god who invented writing. Thoth and Apollo are, of course, two of Stephen's tutelary deities, literary ideals that substitute for the punitive god of the priests. Crane girl or the bird girl contains both the creative secret of woman and the secret of writing. She is both the punishing mother in Dante and the desired woman who holds the secret creativity according to Graves, the writer of myths, Greek and Roman myths. The ivory in her colouring echoes Solomon's Song of Songs. Thy neck is a tower of ivory, which is earlier also used by Joyce. So this phrase tower of ivory is found in Solomon's Song of Songs. Joyce mentions the passage before, attributing it to the Virgin Mary, as is traditional in Roman Catholic reading of the Song of Songs. But here it is the woman's thighs that are ivory. The ivory tower is also the traditional retreat of poets, making Stephen's, like Hamlet's, a fair thought to lie between maid's legs. So in these images, the image of a girl or female is associated with creativity, and therefore the bird girl image or the use of the crane image, which is sacred to both Apollo and Thoth, the god who created or invented writing, the bird girl image therefore also stands for creativity. She was alone and still, gazing out to sea, and when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze. Sufferance means that she was uh, allowing Stephen to look at her, suffering his gaze quietly, and then quietly withdrew her eyes from his and bent them towards the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot hither and thither. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence, low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sleep, higher hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. Heavenly God, cried Stephen's soul in an outburst of profane joy. Very significant. So you see the expression, heavenly God. Stephen's soul cries, not Stephen. What does it mean? That in his mind, Stephen says, heavenly God. Now, this is a religious phrase, but actually Stephen finds his religion in writing or in art. Outburst of profane joy. So by after expressing heavenly God, the author immediately modifies it by saying that it is an outburst of profane joy. It is not religious joy. Profane is the opposite to sacred or religious. So in the tradition of love poetry in the Renaissance, we have profane love and divine love. So John Donne had two sets of sonnets, sonnets of divine love and sonnets of profane love. He turned away from her suddenly and set off across the strand. His cheeks were aflame. That is, he was extremely passionate. And this passion, which began in his sexual desire, undoubtedly there is sexual desire. Joyce does not keep any doubt about it. He makes it very clear that Stephen looks at the girl sensually, and it gives rise to a sexual desire in him, and that is the source of his passion, his cheeks aflame. But there is something in addition. He also becomes extremely passionate about what his new religion is going to be. It is creativity, writing. His body was aglow, his limbs were trembling. On and on and on and on he strode far out over the sands, singing wildly to the sea, crying to greet the advent of the life that had cried to him. So life cried out to him. That is, he must create. Now all these have a double layer of meaning. Stephen thinks of creating life out of life. What does it mean? To reproduce. But it also means to create something meaningful out of your ordinary existence, which is possible through art. So artists create new life out of ordinary life by creating works of art. And often the source of inspiration, both for creating new life by reproduction and creating new life through art, often the source of inspiration most of the time is a woman or a girl or a female figure. Her image had passed into his soul forever, and no word had broken the holy silence of his ecstasy. So this moment is described as a moment of ecstasy. Ecstasy is also sometimes is synonymous for orgasm. Like in the sexual act, people have orgasm. Similarly, it can be sublimated, and in creative act, sometimes artists may have extreme emotion, which is very similar to orgasm, or which is ecstasy. Her eyes had called him, and his soul had leaped at the call. To live, to err, to fall, to triumph, to recreate life out of life. Notice, to leap, that is, to take a leap without thinking of the immediate dangers. So when somebody takes the plunge and pursues a girl, that is a leap where there are possible dangers, but one doesn't care when one is passionate. Similarly, when one decides that one will not do anything useful for the world as ordinarily the world understands, but would take up the vocation of an artist, then one is taking a risky decision, taking a leap. The decision to create art, whether it will sell or not, whether it will provide him with sustenance or not, without considering all these things. So in both these cases, one is instigated or one is motivated by an inspiration. Recreate life out of life, as I explained it to you, has these double nuances, two senses. One is the sexual reproduction, and the other is creation of new life through art, creation of new things. A wild angel had appeared to him, the angel of mortal youth and beauty, an envoy from the fair courts of life, to throw open before him in an instant of ecstasy the gates of all the ways of error and glory. Joyce uses the word error twice. Now, this word is derived from the Latin word or verb erre. Erre means to wander. Milton uses this word in Paradise Lost Book 1, describing the river in paradise wandering or erring, moving, wandering. But error has also, or rather the most common meaning of error is mistake, a moral mistake or a moral transgression. And Stephen wants to err. So to err has this ambiguity, that is either to wander, to venture through uncharted territories, unknown experiences like an artist, or to make moral mistakes perhaps, and have experiences which are sometimes morally not acceptable, and the use of the word mortal. So earlier when the girl was described, Stephen sees in her face mortal beauty, and here also he thinks that the angel has thrown open, an angel of mortal youth and beauty has thrown open the gates. So mortal suddenly becomes a term of glorification by a strange inversion of values. So traditionally everything worldly is mortal, is transient, is prone to destruction, and therefore imperfect. But from the point of view of an artist, mortal becomes significant, because we know only the mortal world. We do not know the immortal world. We have no idea of any other world or heaven or paradise or anything else. So the artist must see beauty in the midst of this mortal world. And that is why the mortal beauty of the girl attracts Stephen. So Stephen does not feel attracted by an immortal beauty or an angelic beauty, but this very mortal beauty, this face which reveals her mortality, that attracts Stephen as an artist. On and on and on and on. So why so many repetitions of on and on? To suggest that a new path has opened before him, on which he must make this journey on and on, this journey which must continue. So it has opened a new avenue to him. He halted suddenly and heard his heart in the silence. How far had he walked? What hour was it? Oh, we do not have time. Do you think I can continue for 3-4 minutes more and finish this chapter? Or you have
Yes,
another
sir.
class? Hmm?
Yes, sir. Yes. Another class after 15 minutes. We have time.
Okay, okay. Then I will finish this chapter. So he came back to his senses. He had walked very far in his agitation, and then he sat there on the beach and he fell asleep. And he closed his eyes in the languor of sleep. His eyelids trembled as if they felt the vast cyclic movement of the earth, and her watchers trembled as if they felt the strange light of some new world. His soul was swooning into some new world, fantastic, dim, uncertain as under sea, traversed by cloudy shapes and beings, a world, a glimmer, or a flower. And here we have the image of the white rose, which is an allusion to the image in Dante of the beatific vision of God. But whereas in Dante, this beatific vision stood for the supreme religious and spiritual achievement, experiencing God or union with God or salvation, however we term it. For Joyce, in this novel, this white rose stands for the culmination of all the rose images throughout the novel. And this white rose does not stand for a heavenly spiritual experience, but a culmination of Stephen's aesthetic sensibility, where religion replaces spirituality, where art replaces religion or spirituality. So he visualizes, he imagines this new world, a world, a glimmer or a flower, glimmering and trembling, trembling and unfolding, a breaking light, an opening flower, a flower that is gradually opening or unfolding. It spread in endless succession to itself, breaking in full crimson and unfolding and fading to palest rose, leaf by leaf, and waves of light by waves of light, flooding all the heavens with its soft flushes, every flush deeper than the other. So this flower of imagination, this rose of imagination, this is nothing new. At the beginning of the novel, young Stephen, the child in his school, in the mathematics class, when the father divided the boys into two groups, a white rose and a red rose, Stephen imagines whether there could be a green rose. There is no green rose in nature, but in imagination it is possible. And here he imagines this rose of light, which unfolds in different shades, from deep crimson to pale pink. Rose also is the name of the color. So what was the significance of the rose symbol? We remember that the rose symbol appeared in this novel whenever there was development in Stephen's psyche. And this is the final rose symbol when Stephen's psyche matures into that of an artist. It serves this symbolic function in indicating the progress of Stephen's psyche. Evening had fallen when he woke, and the sand and arid grasses of his bed glowed no longer. He rose slowly, and recalling the rapture of his sleep, sighed at its joy. He climbed to the crest of the sand hill and gazed about him. Evening had fallen. The rim of the young moon cleft the pale west of sky like the rim of a silver hoop embedded in grey sand, and the tide was flowing in fast to the land with a low whisper over waves, islanding a few last figures in distant pools. So the last paragraph is only a natural image, an image of the sea and the beach, but this realistic image brings us down from the exciting moment of epiphany, or the moment of mental, emotional experience. Okay, so I'll stop here. I will not be able to take your questions right now because I have another class very soon. Okay.